"You are a loser." Judge Rebecca Collins said it without blinking, her cold voice deciding his fate before the trial even began. She glared down at Jacob Miller, judging him purely by the cheap suit he wore. She paused, letting the heavy courtroom silence finish the job. She openly mocked his old truck, his exhausting jobs, and his tiny house. His ex-wife Olivia smiled smugly, but then an elderly woman in the back row suddenly stood up. Then a veteran stood, then a nurse. Soon the entire gallery rose, not for the judge but for Jacob. How could a man they dismissed as a failure command such incredible respect? Jacob Miller was 42 years old and had never once asked a single soul for pity. They thought he was stubborn, but that was just how he was built. He woke up before 5 most mornings, brewing coffee in an old dented pot. Then he drove his noisy pickup truck through the dark, quiet streets of Dayton, Ohio, long before the rest of his neighbors had even opened their eyes. That old truck had over 200,000 miles on it, with a cracked passenger window he kept meaning to fix. But he never got around to it, because someone else always needed his help first. One day it was a leaky kitchen pipe. The next, a collapsing backyard fence that needed support. Or a neighbor who desperately needed a hand before Jacob ever thought about himself. He spent his days loading heavy freight at a warehouse on the east side of town. 3 nights a week, he worked a second shift at a hardware store 15 minutes away. It was punishing, repetitive labor, the kind of physical work that wears a man down slowly but honestly. The hardware store was peaceful. He spent those late hours organizing shelves and helping strangers find exactly what they needed. He was excellent at it, knowing where every single tool belonged. He never made anyone feel foolish for asking a question. It was unglamorous work. It was not the future he had dreamed of as a young man, but it was honest. And Jacob had decided long ago that a clean conscience was worth more than easy comfort. His tiny house was undeniably simple. Just 2 small bedrooms, a cramped kitchen, and a yard bordered by a chain-link fence. But it was his home, or at least, that was the agreement. Their divorce was finalized 3 years earlier, and by the strict terms of that settlement, the Carver Street home belonged to Jacob. Both he and Olivia had agreed. They had signed all the paperwork before a notary, with their lawyers sitting right beside them. The legal agreement was officially filed with the court, completely uncontested. Back then, Olivia seemed deeply relieved just to walk away from it all. She moved into a trendy apartment across town, found new friends, and by all appearances, built a completely new life. Meanwhile, Jacob moved forward in his own quiet, steady way. He cleared the gutters and repainted the porch. He even started a small garden on the south side of the house, growing fresh tomatoes and keeping the soil turned. Even in the cold winter months when nothing grew, he never complained about his ex-wife. He did not have to. Instead of complaining, Jacob simply showed up for others. He never planned these acts of kindness. They just happened, natural as rain finding dry soil. Take his neighbor Frank Doyle, a lonely veteran in his late 60s living 3 doors down. He came home from the hospital with a bad knee and could not manage his lawn. Jacob just started mowing it, asking for nothing. He did this for 4 months straight every Saturday, never accepting a single dollar or even a handshake. His neighbor Frank tried to wave him away at first, claiming he didn't need any charity. Jacob quietly insisted it wasn't charity. He called it neighborly help, returning the next Saturday to do the exact same thing. By week 3, Frank gave up arguing and simply left a cold water bottle out on his porch railing. When Ruth Harding, the elderly widow who lived down at the end of the street, suffered a broken furnace in freezing January, Jacob spent a whole Sunday shivering in her dark basement until he finally repaired the system. With outside temperatures dropping to near zero, Ruth was struggling to stay warm with just a noisy space heater and blankets. Jacob replaced a broken igniter, bled the line, and waited until steady warmth filled every room before gathering his heavy tools. Ruth tried to force $40 into his hand when he finished up. He refused, telling her to save it and buy herself a hot meal. Another neighbor, an exhausted nurse named Sandra, worked brutal double shifts at the local county hospital. She briefly mentioned in passing at a neighborhood block party that her old sedan had been making a horrible grinding noise for weeks, but she had no time to handle it. She joked about it, hiding the sheer exhaustion of ignoring a dangerous car issue. Jacob quietly arrived the next Saturday morning carrying his heavy toolbox. He replaced her dangerously worn brake pads, wrapping up the job in under 2 hours. Sandra stepped outside just as he finished, standing in her driveway staring at him as if trying to comprehend such unexpected kindness. She insisted on paying him. He told her she already did enough saving lives at the hospital, then quietly left. These weren't flashy, dramatic gestures. They were those quiet, unglamorous favors that most people promise to do, but never actually deliver. Jacob simply showed up, no boastful social media posts and absolutely no bragging to anyone. He quietly repaired what was broken, stood by neighbors who felt invisible, and then slipped away. Back to his modest life, never leaving behind a sense of obligation or debt. None of this brought him riches or elite social status. His name never made the local headlines, and he received no fancy keys to the city. To high society, he was just a low-income worker with a cracked truck windshield and 2 jobs. But his struggling neighbors knew the real truth of his character. They saw his incredible heart, unlike his ex-wife Olivia, who possessed a very selective kind of memory. Her recall was shallow, edited purely to suit her selfish narrative. 3 long years after their painful divorce was finalized, she had completely rewritten their past, casting herself as the tragic victim of a husband who lacked ambition. She judged him for his small paycheck and his refusal to chase status. She demanded a giant mansion located in a far wealthier zip code. She craved the elite social standing that only came with money and influence. But Jacob never pretended to be some wealthy, superficial man. In her shallow eyes, his raw honesty was nothing but a pathetic failure. She surrounded herself with judgmental snobs who fueled her bitterness. Over time, she genuinely convinced herself that she had been cruelly cheated out of the luxurious life she deserved. The distorted picture of Jacob she painted in her mind became unrecognizable. She talked about him with total conviction, completely blind to the quiet, unbreakable man he actually was. The lawsuit landed on a Tuesday morning. A process server hand-delivered it to Jacob's door. The man shoved the envelope forward and vanished before Jacob could speak. He stood in the doorway reading it twice, absolutely certain he must have misunderstood the words. Olivia was moving to throw out their original divorce settlement. She claimed she had been forced into signing their property agreement 3 years ago, asserting that she never truly understood its terms, and that the house on Carver Street belonged solely to her. She wanted the court to undo the deal and put the deed in her name. Jacob placed the envelope on the kitchen counter and stood completely still, absorbing the shock. His mind went back to the day they both signed those papers. He remembered the lawyers in the room, and the notary witnessing every single signature. He pictured his copy of the agreement, locked safely in a folder in his top desk drawer. He had done everything right. He had followed every step of the law to the letter. And now, 3 years later, Olivia was standing at the courthouse door claiming none of it was legitimate. He reached out to a lawyer that very afternoon, a man named Gary Sutton, the same man who handled their original divorce. Sutton listened closely, requested a copy of the lawsuit, and called Jacob back early the next morning. His voice was calm but grim. He said the claim itself was incredibly weak. The original contract was solid and fully documented. In any normal courtroom, a garbage motion like this would be thrown out instantly. But then Sutton dropped a detail that changed the stakes of the entire fight. Their case had been handed to Judge Rebecca Collins. Jacob did not know the name, but Sutton filled him in with absolute caution. The hesitant way lawyers always deliver bad news. Judge Collins and Olivia had been friends for years. They ran in the same wealthy circles, attending the exact same charity fundraisers. By all accounts, they were close personal friends. Sutton chose his words carefully, avoiding any direct accusations of bias. He spoke only of legal risk, but the underlying warning was loud and clear. The deck was stacked against him, and Jacob needed to realize that before moving forward. Sutton also quietly noted that 2 other, highly respected attorneys had passed on the case without saying why. That grim reality weighed heavily on Jacob long after they hung up. Jacob sat in silence for 2 days before giving the lawyer his decision. He seriously considered walking away. He imagined handing Olivia the house, letting her win just to avoid a court battle that felt completely rigged. He thought of the garden he planted along the south wall, The porch he had painted twice, and the furnace he fixed himself because a contractor was too expensive. He remembered pulling double shifts for months, desperate to pay the mortgage on time, living on cheap rice and canned soup for 2 weeks at a time. He remembered every single sacrifice. Then he called his lawyer back and told him to prepare for trial. This decision did not come from anger. Jacob simply was not built that way. He did not scheme or simmer. He chose his path the same way he always did, by looking at the hard facts and refusing to pretend things were any different. The house belonged to him. The paperwork was legal. He did absolutely nothing wrong. Since those facts remained true, he refused to sign them away just because things had turned messy. What he could not fully see just yet was how messy this was about to get. When the lawsuit first arrived, he had no idea how far they would take it. He did not know about the private talks already occurring between his ex-wife and the judge before any hearing was even on the schedule. He had no idea that several lawyers he reached out to for a consult had already quietly backed away from the fight without giving him a real reason. He simply focused on what was real and gripped it tightly, like a person holding onto a solid rock in the middle of a rushing river, not because it halts the current, but because it is the only thing worth holding. The first court hearing was scheduled 6 weeks away. Jacob spent that time gathering his paperwork and sorting through records, while consulting with his attorney to present the clearest facts possible. His lawyer was capable and very detail-oriented. Yet Jacob noticed he spoke with the careful hesitation of a man who knows the system is already working against them, regardless of what the truth actually says, or the laws. He never stated it directly. But Jacob had worked hard enough to recognize when someone was softening a blow rather than showing genuine confidence. The night before they faced the judge, he sat at his kitchen's table drinking coffee, with the signed agreement spread out right in front of him. Every sheet bore signatures. Every detail was witnessed. Every date was correct. He had studied these pages so often over the last 6 weeks that he could recite them from memory. Folding the paperwork carefully, he slid it into a folder and placed it by his keys so he would not leave it behind tomorrow. He went to sleep at 10:30 p.m. and set his alarm for 5, just like any other workday. He tossed and turned, but he did not lie there fearing the absolute worst. He had chosen his path. Now he had to face the courtroom. What this quiet father could not have foreseen, what no ordinary observer could have predicted, while sitting alone in his modest kitchen in Dayton, Ohio, was that his strongest defenders were already out there in the world, living their lives across the neighborhood with absolutely no idea that they would soon stand up for him. Nearby, Frank Doyle was simply watching the evening news. Ruth Harding sat reading in her favorite chair under a soft lamp, and Sandra Pierce was driving home from her hospital shift in a car whose squeaking brakes Jacob had fixed for her out of pure kindness. They knew nothing of his legal battle, but they knew the real Jacob Miller, and that truth, in the end, would matter far more than any courtroom bias. That initial court date had nothing to do with finding justice. Jacob realized this within 20 minutes of stepping inside the courtroom. Judge Rebecca Collins stepped through the side door, ascending her bench with the cold grace of a ruler. It was the practiced, untouchable authority of someone used to looking down on men like Jacob. Sharp-featured, flawless, and impeccably dressed, she carried the absolute confidence of a person who never expects to be questioned by a nobody. She scanned his files without even looking up. When her gaze finally lifted, it lingered on his wealthy ex-wife, offering a silent, knowing look of pure alliance. It was a tiny gesture, easily missed by anyone who didn't know how the system worked. But Jacob saw. His attorney, Gary Sutton, delivered a clean, perfectly structured opening argument. Their original divorce agreement was fully signed, witnessed, notarized, and legally filed. There was absolutely no real legal basis for any claim of coercion. No evidence existed, no witnesses were named, and no actual proof was offered. Sutton argued that this desperate motion fell way short of the standard needed to reopen a settled case. It was a simple, honest defense because the facts were incredibly clear. Jacob watched the judge closely as Sutton spoke, but her face remained entirely blank. No interest, no engagement, not even the polite mask of paying attention. Her mind was already made up. But the moment Olivia's high-priced attorney stood up, The judge leaned forward. Her expression softened just a fraction, but it was there. This was Martin Hale, a slick, expensive lawyer who spoke with a smooth, effortless confidence. The calm tone of a man always believed by default. He painted Olivia as a fragile victim, forced into signing away her rights during a weak moment, claiming she didn't grasp the legal weight of what she had originally signed, and that she only now realized the massive fortune she had walked away from. Yet he didn't offer one shred of actual proof. Just a theatrical story told with passion, and the judge swallowed it as absolute truth. Sutton objected twice during this performance. Both objections were instantly dismissed without a word. When Sutton begged the court to look at the notarized signature of consent, Judge Collins waved it off, saying they would deal with it when the time came. It never was. Instead, the hearing ended by dragging them into a long, expensive trial, ordering both sides to submit more complex legal paperwork within 30 days. Jacob left the court, clutching his cheap folder, feeling judged before he even spoke. He had a sick, heavy gut feeling that the game was entirely rigged against him. His lawyer walked beside him down the massive concrete steps. Sutton muttered gently that this was just round one. Jacob merely nodded, keeping silent. He didn't argue. He spent his life doing hard labor, and a working man knows a rigged load when he carries it. And he knew exactly how heavy this stack was. He noticed every single detail. How the judge's pen flew when the wealthy lawyer spoke, compared to Sutton's turns. Page after page for the rich man, but not a single stroke for them. It told him exactly what kind of uphill battle he was facing in the months ahead. The following weeks dragged on in that soul-crushing way only court battles can, bleeding him dry with absolutely zero progress. Yet Jacob quietly provided every record his lawyer needed. He gathered his bank records and mortgage statements, the original settlement papers and letters from their actual divorce. Anything else that clearly proved the honest and mutual nature of what they settled 3 years ago. Sutton filed every document, only to receive a series of cold procedural delays in return. Delayed or dismissed, discarding his hard evidence without ever looking at the truth. It felt like pushing against a thick fog that yielded just enough to absorb his effort, then settled back into place. Through it all, Jacob kept working quietly. He still reported to the warehouse before sunrise. He still put in long evening hours at the local hardware store. He still visited old Frank Doyle when he could, and checked on neighbor Ruth Harding the moment the winter weather turned bitter cold. As we can see, this vicious lawsuit had completely upended his life. But they could not alter his integrity or the steady way he lived. Staying true to himself, refusing to let this heavy lawsuit break his spirit, was the one thing he still controlled. And he clung to that peace with purpose. Meanwhile, at hearings Jacob did not attend, Olivia's expensive lawyers kept talking. They painted him as a predatory man who had taken cruel advantage of a vulnerable woman. The word coercion appeared on every single page. Yet there was never any real evidence, nor statements from their past lawyers. Not a single complaint existed from the actual period of their split. Zero proof existed that she had felt any doubt or confusion when she signed those original papers. There was only their accusation. A story repeated so often that the court began treating it as truth, just because they kept repeating it. When Jacob read the updates from his attorney, he felt a heavy, hollow exhaustion settle deep in his chest. Not simple physical tiredness, but the painful weariness of watching a lie about your life grow into an artificial truth. He only discovered the neighborhood letters by pure chance. He had stopped by old Frank's place one night to drop off a small delivery. A simple grocery bag, knowing Frank's bad knee was bothering him again. Frank had mentioned being unable to walk to the local market, but now he stood at the doorway holding a piece of paper. He told Jacob the neighbors were talking about the legal battle, and he had put some thoughts in writing. He wanted Jacob to read it. Jacob stared down at the paper. It was 2 handwritten pages in a careful block lettering of an old soldier who had kept his structured military habits for life. It detailed in honest words how Jacob had mowed his lawn for months after he got home from surgery. How Jacob never took a single dollar or expected anything back for his quiet help. It was Frank's personal testimony to the absolute integrity of his young friend. Frank promised he would gladly stand up and say those exact words in court. Jacob drove back that evening with the paper sitting beside him, unsure of how to process the deep and quiet emotion it gave him. It was not relief, but something much quieter. A reminder to us all that he was never as alone as those cold courtrooms made him feel. For months he had internalized the ugly caricature of himself that his ex-wife's lawyers had built. This simple letter. It proved there was another truth, built by the decent people who actually knew who he was. Over the next 2 weeks, more letters flooded in. Ruth Harding wrote about a freezing January night when Jacob fixed her furnace and refused to take a single dime. Her short letter was incredibly specific. She noted the exact date, the sub-zero temperature, and how Jacob had stayed until warm air was flowing through every single room before leaving. Sandra Pierce sent a statement to the lawyer's office without Jacob even asking. She detailed a brake repair and other quiet acts of kindness. She remembered how Jacob showed up for neighbors, asking for absolutely nothing in return. Margaret Webb, a retired teacher who lived across the street for over 10 years, wrote a letter so measured and precise, exactly as you would expect from an educator. She listed exact dates and real events. She testified that Jacob was a deeply decent man, not some manipulator trying to cheat the system. Dale Cooper, who ran the hardware store where Jacob worked his night shifts, sent a letter about Jacob's reliability and total honesty with customers. He described 3 times Jacob helped elderly shoppers load heavy items into their cars, expecting nothing back. Sutton gathered every single letter and pushed them into the official court record. It was not the kind of evidence that resolved a legal technicality directly. It was proof of his character, a true portrait of a man built from dozens of small, honest acts over many years. Sutton told Jacob this was helpful, but it was not decisive. They still needed something that directly addressed the actual legal issue, he explained. Something proving the game was rigged against him from the start. Then an unexpected lifeline arrived from a place Jacob never saw coming. A man named Paul Garrett reached out to Sutton's office through their website. Garrett explained that he used to work at Martin Hale's law firm, Olivia's attorney. He had been an administrator there before quitting just a few months ago. He claimed to have critical inside details on the case and was ready to talk, but only if his official words were documented on the record. Sutton set up a meeting within 48 hours. Inside that quiet conference room, Garrett exposed a shocking trail of secret communications going on between Olivia Miller and Judge Rebecca Collins long before any lawsuit was ever officially filed. He was not directly part of those shady discussions, but his role in the firm gave him access to dark secrets never meant to see the light of day. He had read the emails. He heard quiet hallway talks and whispers in rooms where people forgot he was standing. He saw the choice to launch this cruel lawsuit follow almost instantly from a crooked deal, ensuring the judge would rule in their favor. He could not prove every single detail, but he knew exactly what he witnessed. And the heavy burden of staying silent had finally become far worse than any risk of speaking his truth. Jacob sat in the quiet conference room, listening in absolute silence. He had suspected it from the start. He felt it in that first hearing. The judge's eyes darted away, hiding a pattern of dismissed cases that made absolutely no legal sense. But harboring a dark suspicion and hearing it confirmed by an actual insider were two different things. For the first time since this nightmare began, he finally had solid ground to stand on. Not comfort, but real footing. The pressure did not ease. Instead, it grew heavier. Rebecca Collins fast-tracked the date for the final hearing. She scheduled it to deny this working-class father the standard time needed for such a complex case. Sutton immediately filed a motion asking for a fair extension. It was shot down within 24 hours, far faster than typical court reviews. 2 brave neighbors who had offered to help testify in person called the office to report they had been approached by strangers who strongly warned them not to show up in court. They never used the word threatened, but both witnesses quietly backed out of appearing. At least their signed statements remained part of the official file. Then a local newspaper ran a brief story on the case. It cast him as a bitter loser clinging to property that wasn't his, claiming it was wrongfully taken from her in a forced divorce settlement. The piece quoted Olivia's lawyer at great length. Nobody bothered to contact Jacob or his lawyer before hitting print. The story was minor, but it hit his small town like a bombshell. Jacob spent days feeling the sting of judging eyes, knowing people believed a cheap lie. A twisted version of events that looked nothing like reality. Soon, Olivia's attorney quietly delivered a formal settlement offer. The deal was simple. He would sign over his house on Carver Street, and in exchange, she would drop all current and future lawsuits against him. No cash payout, he would walk away with absolutely nothing. Sutton laid out the terms neutrally, keeping his professional duty fully intact. Then he quietly reminded Jacob that the choice was entirely his. Jacob stared at the black and white paper for a long time. He pictured the furnace he had fixed, the repainted porch, and the garden blooming by the wall. He thought of Frank Doyle's letter, written in those neat, careful block letters. He thought of Ruth Harding, who remembered the precise date and freezing temperature in her statement. He pictured Sandra Pierce driving home safely after her night shift using brakes he had fixed. He thought of Paul Garrett sitting across a table, holding secrets he chose to share, simply because carrying that heavy silence had finally broken his conscience. He thought about how hard they had tried to make him feel small. The rushed dates, the biased news, the unfair dismissals. The witnesses they intimidated, and how none of it could change the simple truth. He looked up and told Sutton to decline. The final court hearing arrived on a cold Thursday morning in late November. Jacob arrived in his old pickup truck, its cracked window and 200,000 miles confirming everything they assumed about him. He parked, carried his simple folder inside, and sat at the defense table, undervalued, underestimated, and completely alone. As the courtroom filled up with judging eyes, he looked straight ahead. He refused to look over at Olivia's table. He did not look up at the bench. He kept his eyes on the courtroom wall, calmly waiting for whatever they threw next. It was how he faced every storm, never flinching, never pretending it was easy, and refusing to ever walk away. Judge Rebecca Collins. She started the custody hearing exactly like every other biased session before it. She acted like someone merely playing a part in a story with a pre-written ending. She glanced over the evidence from her high bench, putting on a show of thoroughness, but she moved too fast to be real. Martin Hale sat next to Olivia, looking completely confident and smug in his expensive suit. Jacob's lawyer, Gary Sutton, sat silently beside him with his hands flat on the table. The courtroom was packed with gossiping onlookers, even though Jacob had invited absolutely no one. The trial began with the same exhausting routine we have seen play out for months. Sutton presented the hard evidence, starting with the original settlement agreement, the notarized signatures and all their messages from back during the divorce. He highlighted the complete lack of any complaints from Olivia during the 3 whole years between that signing and this lawsuit. The judge barely acknowledged these critical facts, offering only a meaningless nod. But when the opposing lawyer shared Olivia's side, she spun the same sob story of vulnerability that they had used since day one. The judge hung on every word. She asked Olivia's lawyer questions, but asked Jacob's attorney absolutely nothing. Then Judge Collins turned to face the entire gallery, and her words hit the quiet courtroom like a physical blow. Staring right at Jacob, she announced in a cold, loud voice exactly what her experience had taught her. She claimed she had seen far too many men just like him. Poor men who believed doing the bare minimum entitled them to special sympathy. Losers who confused bitter stubbornness with integrity. Men driving beat-up trucks, working double shifts, expecting the world to applaud their basic duties. She threw around the word loser, treating a cruel insult like a precise legal term. She spat that men like Jacob always tried to blame their personal failures on everyone else, and made it clear that her court would never tolerate that kind of self-pity. She spoke with the sheer arrogance of someone who never expected to be challenged. Olivia did not even bother to look back at Jacob during the attack. She did not have to. Her absolute triumph was already written in the smug set of her shoulders. She sat back and adjusted her posture, holding her pen without writing a single word, like someone getting comfortable to watch a show end exactly in her favor. Her lawyer kept his face completely blank. It was the highly trained reaction of a professional who knew better than to celebrate a victory too early. Jacob did not break. He kept his gaze fixed forward and his rough hands still on the wood. Whatever deep anger he felt, he buried it, holding it in the way he kept most of his private pain. But as you and I know, some things are sacred, and no arrogant judge has the right to touch them. He had already endured far worse insults during this brutal custody lawsuit. He had read uglier lies in their legal filings. But lies could never change the facts, and those facts were all this honest father came to defend. Sutton leaned in, quietly insisting. They entered Paul Garrett's official statement into the record, before the judge dismissed him as just another loser. The judge looked up. Looking up from her papers, she coldly claimed the statement was already reviewed and would get proper consideration. That was code for throwing it straight into the trash pile. Sutton refused to back down. He put it on the record that the document proved illegal, secret communication between the plaintiff and the judge before this lawsuit was even filed. The courtroom fell dead silent. Her face remained frozen, but her eyes narrowed in a brief, tightly controlled flash of panic. She opened her mouth to speak. Before she could find the words, a sudden movement began at the back. Ruth Harding stood up first. She was in her mid-70s, fragile and small, slowly pushing herself up by gripping the wooden bench for support. Once she was standing tall. She spoke clearly enough for the entire room to hear, demanding to speak on behalf of Jacob Miller. Rebecca snapped that public comment was simply not allowed in civil court, ordering the old woman to sit down. But Ruth refused to sit down. She admitted she knew that and was no legal expert, but after living on Carver Street for 23 years, she refused to sit silently while they dragged a good, honest man through the mud like he was some kind of criminal. She told them Jacob had fixed her broken heater on a Sunday. It was freezing January weather, with temperatures in the single digits, and yet he completely refused the $40 she offered. In her eyes, a man who acts with such quiet kindness in private when there is absolutely nothing to gain is not the loser this biased courtroom was trying to make him out to be. Once again, Rebecca ordered her to sit down immediately. But before the judge could yell, Frank Doyle stood up 3 rows behind Ruth. Even in his late 60s, Frank was a massive, imposing man, everyone in the court noticed. He announced his name, proudly stated he was a veteran, and said he had known Jacob for 4 years. He explained that Jacob had mowed his grass every single Saturday for 4 months after his knee surgery, completely unprompted. He never accepted $1 for his help, and he never bragged about it to anyone in the area. He declared that he had sent an official character letter to the court and wanted everyone present in this room today to know that he stood firmly behind every single word. The judge's voice turned hostile. She warned them they were breaking strict rules and threatened to have security clear the entire courtroom if they refused to sit down. Neither of them budged. The bailiff looked to the judge for orders but got none because throwing out a room full of peaceful, standing citizens demanded a different kind of moral authority than this judge currently possessed. Then, Sandra Pierce stood up from the very center of the room. She announced she was a registered nurse and confirmed that she had also sent a written statement to the court and was here to defend it. She recounted how Jacob quietly showed up at her car one weekend, fixed her brakes, and walked away without taking any cash. She explained that she had spent years in emergency medicine, long enough to spot the difference between someone playing a part for an audience and a genuinely good man acting from the heart. As we look closer, we see that Jacob Miller was a good man without a doubt. Margaret Webb stood up from the left side of the courtroom. She had been a school teacher for 31 years. She spoke with measured precision, locking eyes with the judge as she detailed the exact dates and events she had witnessed firsthand during her 10 years living right across the street from him. She never raised her voice, avoiding any kind of exaggeration. She just shared what she knew, speaking with the calm authority of an educator who spent a lifetime making sure the truth hit home. Dale Cooper was the next to stand up. Without hesitation, he described a dedicated worker who never missed a single shift for years. A father who treated everyone with patience, and who had carried heavy items to customer vehicles on 3 specific occasions that Cooper could recall easily, moments where he helped out without expecting a single dollar in return. One by one, more neighbors stood up, some he recognized right away. Others were just familiar faces he had seen around town. A stranger he had helped carry groceries once. A widow whose gutters he cleaned one fall afternoon when he noticed they were clogged and she was away. They stood up with no warning, completely unprompted. They simply refused to sit in silence while this decent father was painted as a failure by a biased court. Judge Rebecca Collins demanded order. She shouted twice to regain control. She threatened to empty the courtroom, but nobody paid any attention. You and I can see this was not some angry, loud protest. It was a quiet, patient wave of support, which made it far harder for her to shut down. In the middle of this, the defense attorney stood up to make a formal legal request. He urged the judge to accept the statement, given the truth now filling the room. He spoke clearly and with confidence. And this time, with the room standing behind him, with spectators recording on their phones and the crowd standing firm, and a reporter in the back row scribbling notes as fast as possible, ignoring their original assignment. The truth could no longer be ignored. The real narrative was now being written in real time by dozens of witnesses. The judge called a sudden recess, slipping out the door while the crowd stood their ground. Nobody left. Those standing stayed on their feet, and those sitting remained completely still. At the defense table, Jacob stared straight ahead, trying to process what was happening. He couldn't bring himself to turn around or look at Olivia. He just felt the immense support behind him. All these neighbors had shown up to save him, and he tried desperately to stay strong. He was a tough man who rarely showed emotion, and he held back his tears. Yet the heavy armor he had worn for months finally started to crack, and the relief washed over him in a way he never expected. The recess lasted 40 minutes. When Judge Collins finally walked back into the courtroom, her confident demeanor had vanished completely. She was no longer relaxed. She looked like someone scrambling to contain a massive disaster. She looked like a person who had just been warned that judging this father by his circumstances was a massive mistake. She announced that the court would officially accept the critical statement. She took it under advisement, citing critical questions about procedural propriety. She referred the entire case to judicial oversight for a preliminary review before issuing any final ruling. She delivered it in a flat voice, using the careful language of someone forced to read a script they absolutely hated reading aloud. The Judicial Oversight Office moved far faster than anyone expected. Within 10 days of the referral, a formal inquiry began into how the court handled things. Paul Garrett's sworn statement was entered into the official record alongside clear documentation of the shady communications between Olivia and the judge that Paul described. Judge Rebecca Collins was placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of the investigation. The case was quickly reassigned to the Honorable Thomas Briggs. He was a man with a 20-year record and no ties to either side. He had a reputation for studying case files with an intensity that left no room for doubt. Judge Briggs reviewed the entire record in under a week. He scheduled no extra hearings and requested no new legal filings. The actual legal question at the heart of this case was remarkably simple once examined by an honest judge with no skin in the game. The original divorce settlement between Jacob and Olivia had been perfectly executed and finalized. It was witnessed, legally filed, and completely binding under Ohio law. Her desperate motion to vacate showed absolutely no proof of coercion, utterly failing to meet the standard needed to reopen a final decree. On a Wednesday morning, Judge Briggs issued a written ruling with direct, undeniable language. Her motion was denied. The original settlement stood. The house on Carver Street belonged to Jacob. Olivia's expensive lawyers filed a quick notice of intent to appeal, then vanished. The appeal never happened. The dirty records of the inquiry into Rebecca Collins became part of public court files. The same journalist sitting in the back row that Thursday morning wrote a second story. This piece was longer, sharper, and much more carefully sourced. It hit the front page just 3 days after the judge's ruling. The scandal didn't travel far beyond the county, but it went far enough. 4 weeks later, Rebecca Collins resigned from the bench, blaming personal issues. The investigation into her misconduct continued despite her sudden resignation. Olivia offered no public statements and completely stopped showing up to her usual social events. Her wealthy friends and allies quietly pulled away from her, fading into the background. the slow way a social circle shrinks around someone, when a person's entire story is exposed as a fabricated web of lies. She faced no official criminal charges. She received no formal punishment other than losing her landmark case. But she had spent years fabricating a cruel narrative that forced everyone to believe the worst about Jacob. Now her lies were measured against the cold facts, and they completely fell apart. This public exposure was her real punishment, a stain that no court ruling could ever erase. Jacob received the judge's final written ruling via email with a brief victorious note from his lawyer. "It's over, the house is yours." Sitting alone with his coffee, he read it carefully twice, just as he had done with the original baseless lawsuit. He made sure he understood every word before letting himself feel a single thing. He placed his phone face down on the table, letting the quiet home envelop him. In the basement, the furnace he replaced himself was running smoothly. The garden along the south wall slept for the winter, but it would bloom again come spring, just like always. Just outside, the front porch he had carefully painted twice stood waiting. From the very start, he knew this home truly belonged to him. He never needed some judge's piece of paper to prove that. What the court ruling actually gave him was entirely different. Proof that the truth, when backed by decent people standing up on their own, could still find a way to be heard. Even in that cold, bitter courtroom. With the deck completely stacked against a guy like him, it was huge. Jacob finally stepped out of the building after signing the last of the paperwork. The late November air bit cold and flat, carrying the scent of snow. Zipping his jacket against the chill, he headed toward his truck. Right there, along the walkway outside the building's main exit, lining both sides of the path, stood faces he knew. Ruth Harding bundled in her heavy winter coat, Frank Doyle, hands deep in his pockets. Sandra Pierce, still wearing hospital scrubs from her morning shift. Margaret Webb, reading glasses perched high on her head just like she did when she wasn't using them. Dale Cooper in his work jacket, the hardware store logo on his chest. And more behind them. Everyday neighbors from years of quiet Saturdays, ordinary mornings, and kindness offered without ever asking for a thing in return. They weren't making a scene. They were simply standing there, the way people do when they want someone to know they are truly supported. A few clapped softly, others just offered a quiet nod. Frank Doyle reached out, resting a hand briefly on Jacob's shoulder as he walked past. Jacob squeezed Frank's hand with his own for a brief second before moving forward. He walked through the crowd slowly, not out of some dramatic performance. He just wanted to look at their faces, locking this exact moment into his memory forever. Forget the cold courtroom, the legal ruling, or some official document. This corridor, these people right here. A cold November morning, smelling of fresh snow, filled with the sound of clapping hands under a gray Dayton, Ohio sky. He climbed into his old truck. The engine sputtered and fired on the second turn, reliable as ever. The crack in his passenger side window caught the pale winter sun just like always. He backed out and started the drive home, down streets he had navigated 1,000 times, past familiar houses and the block where Frank Doyle lived. Past the corner where Ruth's kitchen light was already shining through the window. Behind him, his neighbors quieted down and returned to their daily lives. The same quiet routines they always lived, the very same lives that Jacob Miller had touched in small, simple ways without ever asking for anything. That's the power of a reputation built on quiet actions over a lifetime. It never shouts, it doesn't beg for any attention. It simply stands up when the time comes. And it won't step aside until the truth is heard.